So, Tim, today we are still talking about the elections with them coming up in 2 weeks. Um, and what we wanted to talk about is how to weigh abortion as an issue against some of the other issues. And is it right to be a single issue voter? Now, I've seen many articles talking about why Christians should not be single issue voters. Some accusations that I've seen kind of bandied about is that single issue voting is reductionist or oversimplifying or dumbing down life or binding people's consciences, and that we as Christians who have a whole view of life and the whole life under the lordship of Christ need to be thinking of a whole range of issues when we go into the voting booth, not just one, because Christ doesn't just speak into one issue. Now, just a quote to kick us off here, Tim. Nikki from Christians for Social Action said in a quote, to create a hierarchy of who is most important to God, or what she's referring to here is single issues, where God doesn't create this hierarchy, is to impose our agenda and priorities onto God. So I guess the first question that I want us to discuss is, in single issue voting, are we creating a hierarchy of who is most important? And are we claiming that God has a hierarchy of who is most important? What do you think there, Tim?
Yeah, well, I think there's two quick points. I think obviously issues fit together, don't they? Issues are related. What we're going to think about the beginning of life, for example, is going to also affect what we think about the end of life. Issues of abortion, issues of assisted suicide, they sort of fit together. And I think any coherent worldview is going to exhibit that dynamic, that aspect that we don't just have random issues plucked here, there, and everywhere, or we think this about this and this about that. It comes out of a holistic picture and a holistic worldview, and I think for Christians that's important. In terms of are we imposing our views or our priorities on things? Well, I think obviously what we're trying to do is we're trying to seek and discern what God's will on a situation is. What God has said about X, Y, or Z. And of course, as Christians, we primarily work from the Bible, and the Scripture is our foundational narrative. That is what gives us, that is where our worldview comes from. Really, what we learn about God as a creator, what we learn about the brokenness of the human condition, and the fact that we need politics, we need government at all. They won't exist in heaven, and then what God tells us about how we can sort of seek to restore, to work towards a better world. So our priorities, our concerns, if we're being faithful to God and His Word, should be drawn from God's book, should be drawn from God's heart. The Christian narrative, that God's big story, really. So I, I, d- yeah. So I think it's a little bit of a strange way of coming at the issue. I think as well. I think if we're coming out with something totally left field, then I think that would be more of a question mark. But I mean, I think essentially what Christians have said about the inherent dignity, value of human life, which extends to the child in the womb from conception, that has been something that historically the Christian Church has always maintained and upheld until really the last middle of the last century. So I would say we're not doing we're not the kind of innovators here. We're seeking to restore a mainstream historic Christian narrative across all the main branches of the Christian
Yeah.
world. Yeah, and I also think, and we'll probably come to some of these issues as we go, but I think there's a huge swathe of issues that if you put it to many Christian voters, they would say, well, that's the biggie, that's the big thing we need to be um, concerned about, we need to be voting on. And if you push them, they'd probably say, well, that's because we think that's
Mm.
what God cares about the most. So um, yeah, I mean, and of course in the recent Evangelical Alliance survey, which again we'll come to a bit later, that's exactly what Christians were asked to do. They were asked to kind of,
Yeah.
rank issues, or say, well, what most matters to you in this election, what policies would you be prepared to maybe even switch parties on if they
Mm.
put that in their manifesto as part of their pledges. So it's kind of par for the course, really. So I don't think we're doing anything too strange or unusual here in seeking to make the issue of abortion, the issue of the plight of the unborn child, a key defining
Yeah.
voting issue, Beth.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think that when she talks about creating a hierarchy of who God thinks is important, it's she's kind of starting from the assumption that everyone is on the same level playing field. Whereas in our society, everyone's not on the same level playing field because we have actually dehumanized the unborn child. So we're starting where the unborn child has been dehumanized and everyone else is on this human recognition level. And so, actually, in focusing on abortion, it's not creating a hierarchy of who's more important, but it's trying to reaffirm that the unborn are just as important, which we have lost in today's society. So, I'd argue that actually she's starting from the wrong understanding of what's happening in our society today. And actually, that because we have dehumanized, we need to rehumanize that child so that we can all be on that level playing field, which we would agree, like you said, everyone has equal value and dignity. We're not saying that some people are more important than others, but what we're saying is that everyone should have that equal value and dignity. Um, so, yes,
And I think that would be the
go
case.
on.
Sorry.
Go on, Tim.
No, I was going to say a lot of the times people would say, well, Christians would say, well, we need to, we need to remember the poor, as Jesus says, and we need to make the decisions that are best going to help those in need and help the poor. And I think as Christians, we both say, yeah, absolutely. Those who are most vulnerable in society to things like the cost of
Mm.
living, those who've been hit hardest. I think, yes, I think as Christians, we should be concerned. Um, one of the policies that are going to help them, whether that's greater employment, higher wages, family stability. And of course, one of the things that most of the mainstream parties dodge or fail to really stress is that marriage rates are much higher among those middle upper classes. So in lower earning demographics, the marriage rates are often much lower, and so in a way, the best start in life is to be part of a married family unit. That's kind of just it's proved by all the data. It's just one of those sort of non-negotiables, really. But again, very few parties stress that. But there was a Catholic bishop recently saying that you should push your MP on where they stand on marriage and whether they're committed to marriage as an institution. Um, and I think it's sometimes said, and it's been said to me actually, that, well, if you want to, if you care about abortion, if you care about the unborn child, then what you should really do is vote for the party that's going to do the most to support those in need, whether that's higher levels of benefits, whether that's putting more money into the NHS, etc. And I think, to an extent, we know that the cost of living data, the recent economic situation has led to higher levels of rates of abortion, including repeat abortions, particularly among, that lower
Mm.
earning demographic. But what I'd want to say there is I think it's very dangerous to simply argue that, well, limited financial resources means a greater openness to abort, or even a lower moral threshold, if you like. I also would like to say that in this country, in the UK, there is no, I think it's very hard to talk about absolute poverty. Bringing a child to term, there is going to be a network, a social security network, whether that's child benefit, whether that's universal credit, around you to help you feed that child. I don't think there are going to be children dying from poverty in the UK. So, poverty in the final analysis is not about whether someone can afford Sky, foreign holidays, whether they can even get on the housing ladder, actually, how many times they're able to eat out a month. Um, and to play that off against the decision to end another human life, that cannot simply be put in
Yeah.
economic terms. That decision is about more than finances. So just as it's wrong to see abortion as purely a women's issue, I think it's wrong to see it purely as
Mm.
an economic issue. Life is fundamental. It's the first human right. So I don't think we should be playing into a narrative that the best way to, uh, the only thing we can do to on this issue is to pump more money into the NHS, to pump more money into the benefit system, um, with the kind of the tacit sense being, the best way to control a certain demographic, in this case lower
Mm,
earners, is abortion. And we see that logic at play, don't we, in other parts of the world,
yes.
as the West no longer really exports Christianity, but we do have a burden to bring the blessing of
Hmm.
abortion to the poor globally. So we tell the poor they don't need to have large families. You don't need to struggle to feed your children. There is a better way, which of course is killing them. So so I think, I think as soon as you get into these issues, I think you begin to see some of the issues behind the issues. And you know, yes, we want to help the poor, but to imagine that the only way to do that is, kind of structurally through more benefits through the health system, I think is not the whole story. We want to help people
Hmm.
holistically, body, mind, and spirit. We want to help people see that, at the end of the day, as I say, abortion cannot be reduced to simply an economic or financial decision. This is a decision to deprive someone else of
Yes.
life. That's massive, that's basic. And we shouldn't say that, well, they don't earn much, they don't know what else to do, sort of thing. I think that's really not a good way
Yeah.
to go.
And just these things are exactly the kind of arguments that I was hearing on the streets when I went out on a public education display in Liverpool this weekend. I met a lady who was 37 weeks pregnant and very excited to have her baby. And we got into talking about when does life begin and abortion. And she very upfront said, if I wasn't in the financial situation that I was now, it would be better for my baby to have aborted them. And so this is really the thinking that is that a lot of people have bought into, that life isn't worth living unless the economics or the climate or the state of war or peace in the country, all these things seem to have determining influence on whether life is worth living. So, Tim, shall we start to dive into some of these other issues that people
Yeah,
often will say, well, we need to weigh
absolutely.
these things against abortion. And a lot of the time, people may say, well, then that candidate isn't very good on the issue of abortion. They are pro choice. However, their economic policy is really good, or their immigration policy is very good. And I can agree with that. So, yeah, let's dive into some of these things. Off the bat, the EA survey of I think it was about 1,300 evangelicals in the UK, all on the issues surrounding politics, voting, the issues that they want to see. They were asked to rate some of the issues, the topics that they thought were the most important issues facing the UK today. And the three that came out the top were the economy, poverty, and inequality. So we've already kind of talked about why the economy isn't a reasonable issue to elevate above abortion. But Tim, what about things like inequality?
I mean, I want to pick up something there about that
Oh, yeah,
conversation you had
sure.
with that lady, the pregnant mother, who was 37 weeks, and so she is putting herself in a position where she feels like the best choice, that she was in the best position to make a choice for her unborn child, which was, if she'd have been in different financial circumstances, um, it would have been better
Mm,
to abort that child. So the whole pro-choice narrative really boils down to, well, actually, in that situation, the decision to abort, the mother's choice, takes precedence over the baby in her womb. Because I don't think, how many babies want to be aborted? Well, none of them do. So what you're saying already, you're elevating somebody above,
mm,
another person. So there's a hierarchy of choice. There's a hierarchy of decision making. So the whole pro-choice narrative is based on a massive inequality, really. That the person with the power, In this case, the mother or the parents. And of course, we always say that often the decision to abort is a massive pressure from not the mother herself, but maybe
Yeah.
boyfriend, etc. So the decision to abort, um, the, the adults involved, the adult or adults involved, they are already kind of, just by virtue of being stronger, more powerful, um, their, the whole thing is based on inequality, really. Their decision trumps the life of that vulnerable child because they're not able to fight back, they don't have a voice, they can't be seen, etc., etc. So I think if you want to talk about inequality, and I do think inequality exists in the UK. I think one of the reasons actually that the Tories are collapsing is because the whole thing about levelling up across the country, it's never happened. HS2's been scrapped. It's the usual story. All the money, all the resource goes to
Hmm.
the southeast, goes to London. So, you know, I don't think they were really serious about that whole levelling up agenda. I think it was just a sort of self-serving narrative to get them some seats in the Red Wall. But I think if you want to talk about fundamental equalities, then I think you have to realise the 250,000
Yeah.
unborn children that are being aborted every year based on the 2022 statistics. Where is their voice? Where is their place at the table? Well, it's just non-existent. So whatever other things, whatever other issues of inequality there are in the UK, whether that's economic, whether that's, there's pockets of racism, etc. still, um, I think they all pale into insignificance, really, when you come back to that fundamental issue of, again, the
Hmm.
right to life, the most fundamental, most basic human right of all, that has been denied to 250,000 of our of British people, British, citizens, just because they happen to be at a certain age and stage of development and in a certain location within the womb of their mothers. So, yeah, it sounds nice, it sounds good, it sounds
Yes.
Christian, but is
Yeah.
there much
Yeah, I
behind
agree.
it?
And when it comes to things like inequality, um, abortion is such a foundational uh, political and moral issue in terms of everything else, because if we don't have the right to life, if we don't recognize the intrinsic value from conception as all human beings, then there's just an arbitrary sliding scale of who else isn't valuable and who else doesn't deserve dignity. And so
Yes.
if you can't affirm that the child in the womb is valuable as a human being and deserves political legal protection, then how can you then justify trying to end inequalities in other areas, such as you mentioned, racism or financial inequalities? Because all we're saying is that the stronger are imposing their strength on the weak, saying that the weaker are not human beings, and that's exactly the same that you get in any other injustice in history. The with slavery, the white people imposing their strength on black people into slavery. With women's suffrage, men and women, with the Jews in the Holocaust, all of these are founded upon either we believe that all life as human beings are valuable and worthy of dignity, or we don't. And so you can't claim that you care about inequality if you're not able to say, actually, we care about all human life. It is really the foundational issue that will actually have an impact on other policies, even if it's not explicit currently. When you take that logic to its logical conclusion, you see that actually we can't make any claims about all people being equal if we actually believe some people aren't. So I think that's quite important to highlight there. Anything else you want to say about inequalities, Tim, before I move on to the next issue to weigh?
Not only just to come again, I just think it's helpful when you have actual, people's actual words and actual experience. If you break it down to that,
Mm.
that mother, pregnant mother, are you actually essentially saying that for lack of Sky TV, for lack of branded trainers, for lack of a foreign holiday or whatever, that life is not actually going to be worth living. That child's life
mm,
is not worth it. I mean, you just, I struggle to even,
yes,
yeah, I struggle even to comprehend that because they're the sort of essential, these are not even Maslow's hierarchy, whatever it is. These are not things that you need to survive, are they? These are sort of added extras to life. And I think most children, what do they really need? They need a loving home environment. They don't need a load of expensive
yeah,
junk, or children make their own experiences. Children play, that's so. Yeah, I just find it really sad actually to hear that kind of thing. But it's obviously it's trotted out in terms of economics, but it's also trotted out in terms of
mm,
disability, or that we've been told by the doctors the baby's going to have X, Y, or Z.
yeah,
The kindest thing to do for that child
yeah,
is to kill them. I mean, you know, when you actually say it out loud, you think, "Wow, how did we get to that point?" But this is the narrative we're living in. We've got a completely functional view of human value, of personhood, that if people can't do X, Y, or Z, that their lives are useless, which is essentially what the
mm,
Nazis said as well. If people can't afford a certain standard of living, they're useless. They're expendable. I just think when Christians start trotting out this stuff, start repeating it as well, that's when I think we really have lost our way because
yeah.
wow, it's the polar opposite
Yeah,
of what God
I
says
mean,
essentially.
to say
Sorry, yeah,
because
Con.
I don't have something, you don't deserve to be someone. It just doesn't. There's the dissonance there, isn't there? Because I don't have, you don't deserve to be.
Yeah.
Um, and I think one thing I do on the streets is when I lead people in a conversation and get them to actually admit, yes, if I didn't have the financial stability, I wouldn't. It would be better if my baby was killed. And when they say it out with their mouth, sometimes I think people need to just hear that to realize, whoa, actually, that's quite an extreme position
Yeah.
to say just because I didn't.
It is
It is
extreme.
extreme,
It
isn't
is
it?
extreme.
But because people don't necessarily say it in those kind of terms, they don't realize that their position is extreme. So should we jump on to the next one? This is another
Let's do.
conversation that I had on the streets in Liverpool this weekend um, about war. So obviously, this is going to be
Okay.
spoken about a lot in the upcoming elections. How will the upcoming British government um, support war efforts abroad, or will they recognise a Palestinian state, or any of these things? But it came back on the streets to the question of genocide, and someone said to me, "You can't be pro-life if you don't recognise the genocide in Gaza and do something about that." So, Tim, why again is this not actually, well, yeah, how can we weigh this against abortion and which one should be more important? Because obviously, bloodshed, it breaks God's heart and it breaks our heart. So, war is an incredibly difficult issue that needs to be addressed.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to say, I won't dodge the thorny political issues, but I think the first thing to say is no party in the UK is standing on a platform where they're saying we support genocide in the Middle East or we support the obliteration of the Ukrainian nation. That you won't find that in any
Mm,
manifesto unless I've really missed something. Um, but on the other hand, all the major political parties, whatever their slight caveats here or there, they are standing on a platform where they are committed to maintaining reproductive justice and women's sexual choices. Abortion. So I think I think the whole question is framed a bit oddly, but I would look. I would say that these. I don't think you necessarily play issues off against each other like this. So I would say, from my position as a pro-life person, that I want, I want to protect life in this country, around the world. wherever it may be, especially innocent life. So, primarily children and women in the first instance. So when I look at the events in, say, Ukraine, I see a kind of unprovoked act of aggression there, the invasion of Ukraine against a sovereign state. Uh, Whatever I may or may not think of Putin's policies versus Zelensky's, to me, Ukraine was about one country just invading another and bombing them and committing all sorts of atrocities. And,
Mm.
there's also stories of rape and humanitarian, um, you know, uh, violations from the front line in Ukraine. So I think, and the British government has clearly sought to stand with Ukraine against Russia, as most of the West has. In terms of the Middle East, which is probably much more contested in terms of there's religion there, there's politics, there's a lot more going on, isn't there, in the Middle
Mm.
East? Um, what I would say, and this is not, there will be different opinions or interpretations, but I would say, the terrorist atrocity that began the current situation in October, when 1,200 or more, Israelis, Jews were killed. And again, it was a bit like Russia. It was unprovoked. It was completely, but it was obviously targeting particularly the weakest, the most vulnerable. They were all
Mm.
targeting the civilians, etc. That was a terrorist atrocity. There's no other words for it. I think you then got to weigh up the Israeli response, which has obviously been pretty strong, pretty heavy-handed, whatever way you want to look at it. And if you're comparing figures, sheer casualty numbers, then obviously a huge number more Palestinians are being killed in the Israeli response, including, we should say as well, many, many women and children alongside Hamas combatants. So, so am I for the death of women and children in Ukraine, in the Middle East? Well, no. As I say, I'm pro-life, but I think, as I say, the idea of you kind of play one off against each other. Because again, if you asked Rishi Sunak, if you asked Keir Starmer, Nigel Farage, are you for the killing of women and children? Well, what are they going to say? They're going to say no.
Yeah.
Of course they are. No one is for war. No one is standing on that kind of platform. But if you ask them, are you for um, a women's choice? Are you for reproductive justice? They're also all going to say yes. And then when you remove the euphemism, when you break down what their language actually means, it means we are for killing the child in the womb, killing innocent human life. So that's one way to answer the question. As I say, others will have
Hmm.
different views on the rights and wrongs of the Israeli-Palestinian, Israeli-Gaza conflict. But to me, that's how I would begin to
Yeah.
go about responding to that. That first of all, you don't play one genocide off against another. You don't say, well, was Cambodia worse than the Holocaust? Was Rwanda, worse than it? I mean, innocent human lives are being killed purely on the basis of their religion, their ethnicity, their tribal group. That's a horror and an offence to God, come what may. In terms of the abortion genocide, they're being killed primarily on the basis of their age and stage, and the fact that they literally cannot defend themselves. They have no voice. So I don't think you play one genocide off against another. I think you stand firmly with life and with justice. The Bible talks extensively about protecting the rights of the vulnerable, the fatherless, the widow, in the Old Testament particularly. To me, that extends absolutely to the child in
Mm.
the womb. So that's perhaps what I'd say, Beth, but I appreciate there's other thoughts, other things to throw into the mix
Yeah.
on
I
that.
think, well, what I ended up saying to this lady on the street was, I can't necessarily speak to the whether or not there is a genocide taking place. But what I can speak to is that there's something very similar to genocide taking place here in England. And I think it's important that as a government, we have no moral authority to go and tell others what to do when we ourselves are killing 250,000 of our children every year. How can we stand and say that we are for life and for defending the innocent and the vulnerable when we are actually killing the innocent and the vulnerable amongst us? in our own soil. So I think it's very important to say yes, we are for life, and any unnecessary death is wrong. We shouldn't do that. But how can we say that we are in defense of those lives when we intentionally end them here in our own land? It's kind of one of those things. You can't go off and tell other people what they're doing is wrong when we've got this huge plank in our own eye. And I'm not saying that war is just a speck in someone else's eye, but what I'm saying is that there's a hypocrisy there that we have to deal with ourselves first before we go and challenge other people.
Absolutely. And I think I'm reminded of obviously we've touched on this again in the recent past, but France's decision to enshrine abortion as a constitutional right, you know. So whenever you hear France, whenever you hear Emmanuel Macron pontificating on X,
Mm,
Y, or Z, remember that this is what he believes, that this is what he believes governments, countries should be founded upon, that part of the very core of his constitutional vision for statehood is depriving the innocent of life in the womb, of killing the unborn. I mean, I think that's a shocker, and I think I think I think the Vatican put him straight. They said there is no human right to abortion. There is no, we've invented this right, but it's completely fictive. You have no right to kill another human person, another human
yeah,
infant in this way. It just doesn't exist. However many people you get on your side, however many UN resolutions, however many X, Y, or Z, it doesn't exist. It's fictive. It will not stand before God. That's really all there is to it. So,
yeah.
so yeah.
So, the last issue that I want to weigh against abortion that people might be voting on is climate change. Now, in the Evangelical Alliance survey, climate change was number 7 on the issues that people thought would be really important in this upcoming election. Here in Norwich, I know that the last time that there was an election, Conservatives didn't come close, but Labour and the Green Party were very, very close in who got the seat in Parliament for Norwich. So I know here, where I am, climate change is a huge influencing factor in how people will vote. So I'm sure people say it as well, don't they? That actually, to sort climate change, we need abortion because people are the problem with climate change. So why is it that climate change shouldn't influence us so much as abortion, Tim?
I think it's a very common narrative, isn't it? Both in terms of the concern for the environment, but also the sense of this, we're almost pitting human life and human procreation against the
Mm,
planet, and the two somehow cannot exist. They're in constant conflict, which is exactly the opposite of what the
yes.
scripture says. But it's very common. And so I was reading something from a guy called John Caldwell, who was the CEO of Phones for You, and basically he was a major Tory donor in the last election, but has now switched to Labour. And it was interesting, his reasons for going for Labour rather than Reform UK were that, well, Reform don't really, they're a bit fuzzy on climate change. They're not very clear on the environment, whereas obviously Labour are gonna sort it all out in his view. So I think it's something we've encountered all the time. I mean, I think, and yeah, again, first off the bat, let me say, the vision to care for the natural world, to be stewards of the natural world, is given in the first chapter of
Mm-hmm.
the Bible. So Christians are not about raping and pillaging the earth. Christians are about stewarding God's creation. The earth does not belong to us. It does not belong to the next generation. It belongs to God, and that's the most that's the most fundamental thing one has to say about this planet. It belongs to God. God created it, and so of course our responsibility is to steward it, to treat it in the best possible way, um, as part of our as part of the creational mandate. Um, but again, I would say to this guy saying the planet is the first priority, I would still say that life is our first
Yeah.
priority. You know, um, if if you if you if people are killed, then there's not going to be no one left to steward the earth God has given to us. Um, I also think there is a degree of alarmism around climate change. I think, you know, I mean, when I was growing up, there was stuff about the ozone layer, there was stuff about acid rain, and it was all pitched in the similar kind of apocalyptic tenor that you know, we've got months left, we've got weeks left, and if it goes above a certain thing, if this hole in the ozone layer gets a bit bigger, we're all gonna kind of, and you know, things have been pulled back, and I don't doubt that things will be pulled back in on this question. Why I think the number one reason, though, Beth, why I think you can't put the climate above this issue of abortion is when people say, well, climate change, it's you know, we're all going to die, the planet's going to get too hot and all the rest of it. I would simply ask them, well, how many people has climate change killed in the UK in the last year or last 10 years, even the last 50 years, if you want? I mean, and I've no idea what answer they'd come up with, um, if they were brave enough to put sort of a figure on it. And that's, again, that's not to say that the climate perhaps has not exacerbated certain medical conditions. It may have worsened certain climatic events, even in the UK, perhaps
Mm.
localized flooding. But even then, I think to prove a direct link is difficult. I mean, again, if you ask them the question, well, how many people in the UK has climate change killed? I think you're going to draw a blank look. But if we ask that question of abortion, Beth, first of all, there is no
Yeah.
ambiguity because the government keeps records. It's not some pro-life group who have cooked up some figures somewhere. The government themselves keep the records for this. It's the Office of National Statistics that will tell you that in 2022, 252,122 infants were killed in the womb. So I haven't made that up. You haven't made that up. That's what the government have said the NHS, the great NHS, have done. So there's no ambiguity. There's none whatsoever on the data. And the second point, the related point, as I say, if we go back to that year 2022, the figures are so staggeringly high, which is the most
Yeah.
recent data we have. The figures are so staggeringly high, over a quarter of a million lives lost to abortion. That's more than the population of Southampton, to put that in perspective. You know, it's a figure that should shock us, that should shame us, I think, to the very core of our being. How can you compare those kind of
Mm.
figures with anything else? I mean, when you begin to comprehend, I mean, how do you even comprehend that number? But when you begin to comprehend the scale of the slaughter, which I think rightly needs to be called a genocide of the preborn, how can you really compare any issue to this
Yeah.
issue, Beth?
Yeah, and I'm just going to quote here from Matthew 23, where Jesus says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former." And I think this speaks to it that we do have to weigh what are the more important issues going into this election. And fundamentally, life and death are the most important issues. How can you speak of justice and mercy and faithfulness and allow the innocent killing of more than 250,000 children every year? I think this might be a word to us in the church. Are we tithing on our spices and our mint and our dill and neglecting the more important things that are going on in this nation? And Jesus is saying that those former things aren't wrong, but it's when we neglect the more important things that we become hypocrites. So, Tim, if we're bringing this back to the church, how should churches think about all these issues, weighing them up? And should churches advocate for single issue voting in this election?
I personally think we should. As I say, I think it's an issue that just puts all other issues into the shade. You know, there is really. very hard to compare them because it is such a significant thing. I would also really want to push back at this idea, which again has been bandied around, and I've heard from other Christians, well-meaning Christians, that voting purely on the basis of abortion of the unborn is somehow a
Mm.
wasted vote. This is, you're kind of you're squandering your democratic right on this. It's a little bit of a vanity project, perhaps. You know, a vote to make abortion a defining issue, a vote to put the unborn and their plight at the center of people's consciousness is never a
Yeah.
wasted vote. It might not be a majority vote, but it's not a wasted vote. And ultimately, we don't make ethical choices, moral choices based only on the outcome of or the likelihood of success. We make decisions because it's the right thing to do. Elections may be decided by the number of votes, right and wrong or not. God says abortion is wrong. Nature itself teaches us that. It doesn't matter how many people vote for it. No number of people voting for slavery
Mm.
can make it right. The Nazis being democratically elected did not
Mm.
make their policies right. So I think this is an opportunity to speak prophetically into the current context, and I would say the current broken political system, and to spread the word about a cause that matters to us and should matter to the same degree to the whole of God's church in the UK. Many other Christians around the world would see abortion as a key defining voting issue. Why is it that the church in the UK do not? We need to get off the fence. We need to stop pleading neutrality on this. We need to stop making excuses, frankly. If churches, pastors are willing to speak out against the war in Ukraine, about climate change, against child poverty here in the UK, and not be seen as overly political, what is it that stops pastors, churches speaking clearly with the same urgency on
Mm.
abortion? There's no reason why we shouldn't be, and yet it is. And so I think we have to conclude that there's some other dynamic at play. And again, we've we've touched on this in the past with Dave, particularly what is going on, and we can surmise some of the reasons: a desire not to appear judgmental
Yeah.
or intolerant, a fear of speaking to what is wrongly labelled, I think, a women's issue, rather than a child's issue or a justice issue, a fear perhaps of appearing right wing or socially
Hmm.
conservative. Again, there never seems to be that apprehension pertaining to socially progressive or left wing causes, including abortion, we might say. Um, and I just think, if we are ultimately filtering our speech, our theological judgments, our political opinions based on the world's opinions, then again, I think we're in trouble. The book of James says friendship with the world is enmity with God. Um, Now, look, I don't want to stop Christians campaigning against unjust wars. I don't want to stop Christians running food banks or debt centers. Of course, I don't want to stop Christians standing in solidarity with the poorest people in their community as well as in the planet. But I want them to recognize that a consistent and coherent Christian ethic means caring for the most vulnerable, advocating them, whatever the political ramifications of that stance. Whether doing so draws the heat of anti-Christian secularists, left-wing fanatics, or even those in your own
Mm.
church. I want Christians to advocate for their unborn neighbour and to tell the truth about the reality and also the scale of abortion in this country as well as around the world. And our sort of heartbeat, our heart's desire here at Brephos is that be reflected in the preaching and teaching of the
Yeah.
local church. And that's why, so often we appeal directly to pastors, to church leaders, to church elders to step up. You know, Evangelical leaders have been
Mm.
woefully quiet on the issue of abortion, and I would say almost complicit really in their stance through their lack of clear voice. And so, whether that's evangelical bishops from the Church of England, whether that's leaders within the FIEC, the Baptist Union, other Protestant churches, there is literally a wall of silence when it comes to speaking about abortion and advocating for the unborn child. And I think, that needs to end.
Yes.
We need to recognize the double standards, the hypocrisy, the
Mm.
inconsistency on this. As I say, we need to get off the fence and start advocating for our unborn. neighbour.
Yeah. And a statistic that always stands out to me is from Eric Metaxas's letter to the American Church, where he correlates the similarities between Nazi Germany in 1930s and current day America. And it's that there were 18,000 pastors, 3,000 stood in support of Hitler, 3,000 stood against Hitler, and 12,000 remained silent. Now, we're not saying that Dietrich Bonhofer or the Confessing Church, who were very vocal against Hitler and what he was doing to the Jews, are we saying that they had a wasted vote? You know, it's important to see that when we look back on these injustices in history, we would say that actually he did the right thing to stand up against him, even if he didn't have the majority support. And so I think it's important, if we believe that this is the greatest social injustice that is being perpetrated on our hands and we are just being silent, will we look back and be counted amongst those 12,000 silent pastors who allowed the Holocaust to take place? Imagine if just a few of them had stood up against Hitler along with the Confessing Church. How different could history be? And I think it's important for us to examine ourselves before we go into this election. Will we stand up and be counted, even if the rest of society says that this is a good thing? Abortion is a right that women need to have and needs to be protected. Are we willing to stand up against that because we know the word of God, we know that he hates the shedding of innocent blood, and we know that he won't hold us unaccountable if we're silent? So, Tim, before we close, do you have any final words to people before they go into the election booth on July 4th?
I think what you've shared there, Beth, is really helpful about bringing it the parallel really with 1930s Germany, the evangelical churches who remained silent, and because they remained silent, that allowed the most, one of the most horrific acts of genocide ever to be perpetrated. I think this is the confusion we're in, because how many Christians today would hold up Bonhoeffer as a hero? But at the time, he would have probably been seen by a lot. Clearly, you've just said, as by a lot of the majority of evangelical churches, pastors, as a bit of a agitator, maybe a little bit too left wing or whatever. Maybe just, oh, you got your bee in your bonnet about the Jews, Dietrich. Just pipe down. Let's just get on with
Mm,
preaching the gospel. And you know, the one thing I would say also about reading the Evangelical Alliance report, Thinking Faithfully About Politics, which was a great resource, and I do recommend folks to check it out if they haven't already. But it's such a confused picture. So on the one hand, it's this desire to help those in need. It's a desire for more Christians to enter politics, to change the current status quo, to be radical, to be arrested for Jesus. That's what literally some of the responses say. Um, but then on the question of abortion, it's way down the pecking order. And even some 14% of self-described evangelical Christians would be less inclined to vote for a
mm,
party that sought in its manifesto to reduce the age limit up to which abortions can be performed from the current 24 weeks. So 14% actually, that would put them off party. I mean, what on earth? And I suppose yeah, what can one say about that? And
yeah.
we could parallel it again with Nazi Germany, but that may be. But I think the important thing to say is, let's be clear: this is a significant issue. This is the justice issue of our day, of our times. Whatever the church in the UK makes of it, I would appeal again. My heart's desire is that the church puts its own house in order on this issue, that pastors begin to preach and teach about it in a consistent, coherent way, as they would other ethical issues. Um, because at the moment, the victims, women, and especially unborn children, are being let down. So if you have a chance on the 4th of July to vote in a way that is for your unborn neighbour and against the abortion genocide, whether that is by voting for a Vote Life candidate, whether that is voting for another smaller party that is clearly pro-life, whether it's perhaps even voting for a strong, self-confessed pro-life MP of another party, then please do
Mm.
it. Please do consider, if you're going to vote in some other way, if you're going to vote for an MP who is not themselves pro-life and is simply representing a mainstream party that will continue to be more of the same, I would encourage you to really reflect and pray whether that is how God wants you to use your one vote. Whether that is God's will for our nation, for our church, to continue with the current status quo, where, as we've said, over 250,000 children in 2022 were killed in the womb, and sadly, Beth, I think that'll probably be more in
Yeah.
2023, and it'll be more at the end of this year, unless something major
Yeah.
changes. So please do pray and reflect on how you can use your vote for the unborn.
Yeah. Thank you. And just as we close, I'm just going to quote this scripture once again. I think we've heard it already on the podcast before, but this is Deuteronomy 30, verse 19, where Moses says, "This day I call heaven and earth as witnesses against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life, so that you and your children may live."